Hi class. In this module, I'll talk about some of the ethical issues involved in social science research, in behavioral health research more generally, and sexuality research specifically. I'll talk about some of the issues more broadly and conceptually, and then I'll talk a little bit about IRB issues. And then your text, as well as the NIH training, I think cover a lot of the history. So I won't go into a ton of detail about some of the history and some of the awful events that led us to having ethical guidelines that we have to follow now. So you're probably all familiar with these from having done the NIH training, from having had some level of exposure to research in the past. These are the basic three ethical principles that guide our understanding of ethics in research. These are based on the Belmont Principles for the Protection of Human Subjects. And these are beneficence, justice, and respect for persons. Your NIH training talks a little bit about the definitions of each of these. I'll go over them fairly briefly. Beneficence is this idea that we basically want to do no harm and try and minimize harm and maximize potential benefits. We often think of these in potential because it's often not a guaranteed harm or a guaranteed benefit necessarily. But we want to try and think about how to minimize harms and maximize benefits. In terms of justice, we think about trying to distribute the benefits and risks of research fairly across people. And so in this case, we want to try not to select participants or people based on purely convenience. I think this is something that we muddy quite a bit because so much of our research is about college students, which are very much a sample of convenience. The other side of this that we think we do tune into a little bit more is not selecting people simply because they're vulnerable to manipulation. So we don't experiment with prisoners just because they are prisoners and therefore vulnerable to participating in research and to manipulation. So I think we attend to that one a little bit more than the first part of that justice piece. But we also want to make sure that the benefits actually then go to a wide variety of people and don't just work for a small group of the population, which is another piece that I think we don't think enough about sometimes. The third principle is respect for persons, and this is treating people as autonomous agents. And again, coming back to that vulnerable population piece, protecting those with diminished autonomy. So this is really about autonomy and being able to facilitate autonomy for people and make sure that people are making informed, autonomous choices. So when we think about potential harms and benefits in sex research specifically, and how we think about these principles in sex research and some social science research more broadly, when we think about respect for persons and autonomy, one of the main things that we think about here is obtaining informed consent. And this is often based on complete research information, or as complete as we can give people to minimize harm while still maintaining the integrity of our research. If we need to omit some details during the consent process, or if we are conducting research that involves deception, for example. But we want to try and balance this as well with the need to obtain sexual information from those who might not necessarily volunteer to participate in sex research. So in some cases, if we tell people in our advertisements and our informed consent that this is all about sexuality, we're going to get some selection bias in that situation. And so only certain kinds of people or certain kinds of people are more likely to participate in sexuality research than others. And so sometimes we may want to try and sort of downplay or limit the information that we include about the sexuality component of our research. This is often not really possible with IRBs today. I have had situations in which I have indicated on a consent form that the questions are all about sex and sexuality and sexual risk behavior. And my IRB came back and said, you're asking about childhood sexual abuse, and you have to put that specifically in the consent form to let people know that you're asking specifically about childhood sexual abuse, because that's such a sensitive topic that people need to be able to opt out of the research if they don't feel comfortable talking about that, or if that will be somehow a trigger for them. And so again, I think this is a balance of thinking about the potential harm and the potential benefit from understanding research from the perspective of people who have had those experiences. When we obtain informed consent, the signature, documenting informed consent is often something that we think about in research. In some situations, we can get a waiver of that consent if that consent form, that signed consent form, would be the only marker of their participation in our research. We can get a waiver. There are other situations in which we could potentially think about getting a waiver of documented consent. Often, even when we do research online, there needs to be some sort of a checkbox indicating informed consent, and different IRBs will ask for different kinds of workarounds in those situations. We also want to make sure that people comprehend what we're asking them to do in informed consent. And there is some interesting research. Michael Wiederman talks about it in his sexuality research handbook, indicating that that people often have varying levels of understanding of their ability to withdraw from research. In some situations, actually, it's been documented that asking people to sign a consent form, even though they are told that they can withdraw from the research at any time, asking them to sign makes them feel a bit more like it's a contract. And people who have signed a consent form are actually more likely to indicate that they can't withdraw than people who didn't sign the consent form, even though they both were given the information that they could withdraw from the research at any time. So it's important that we really make sure that people understand what they're signing, they understand the full extent of the research, and they understand their rights as a research participant. We also want to make careful decisions about reporting harm, and I'll say more about this in a minute in terms of balancing some of our professional ethics with research ethics. But in a lot of situations in sexuality research, and in particular, we may be asking about things like childhood sexual abuse or sexual assault, intimate partner violence, things like that, that for some of us, depending on our professions and roles in these people's lives, we may be either mandated to report or feel like we should report. And so that can be a balancing act between our sort of professional and research ethics. We also want to make sure that we assure voluntary participation and help people understand that they can leave research at any time without any consequence or penalty. And a major piece of autonomy is also protecting anonymity and confidentiality. So we want to be able to ensure that people have privacy in responding, that we space people apart if we're asking them to respond in a classroom, that we give them some warning that if they're filling out a survey online, the questions are going to be of a sexual nature, and they should probably try to go somewhere where they won't share their screen with anybody. And we also have to maintain confidentiality or anonymity in data collection and storage. So in how we collect the data, in how we connect data to participant information that would identify them, how we store those and make sure that those are stored separately, and that the links between those are eventually destroyed. When we think about justice, one of the main things we think about is this equitable selection of participants for the research aims and setting at hand. Again, as I mentioned before, we often want to think about moving beyond college student samples when appropriate, although sometimes requiring research populations that presents ethical dilemmas, for example, LGBT adolescents. And for those of you interested in some of these ethical issues, I would really recommend reading some of Brian Mustansky's work. He has done some really interesting writing about the role of IRBs. His latest work is actually about how some of these strict enforcement of these guidelines actually perpetuates the HIV epidemic among adolescents because it prevents us from doing research among the very people who are most at risk of HIV. So a really interesting approach to think about how some of these ethical guidelines intended to protect people are actually preventing us from doing research with the very populations that need it the most and being able to get effective treatment and prevention care to those folks. So really interesting perspective for those of you who are more interested in this. I also think we have to think in terms of justice about applying research to practice. So where does this research go eventually? And do the benefits of that research actually ever go out into the world? Do they go out into the world equitably? And I think that's a piece that we don't often think so much about in research. And then the third principle, beneficence, or what's sometimes called non-maleficence, is again attending to these potential losses of privacy or breaches of confidentiality. We also have to think about distress, and I'll talk more about this, and the extra reading that we did for this week talks a bit about distress, but we have to think about, is that really a risk? Is that a potential harm? What kind of distress are we talking about? What kind of distress can we typically anticipate when doing this kind of sex research? I think another piece of this is being sort of culturally competent and non-judgmental about people's life choices and beliefs and attitudes. And this is really about balancing these risks and benefits. There are always sort of potential risks to participating in research. If somebody hacks my computer, they may be able to get contact information for people, identifying information for my participants. So always certainly a potential risk, although we do a lot to guard against that. And then thinking about then what those benefits are and being able to say that those benefits hopefully will outweigh those potential risks. And the article that we read for this week talks a lot about this, so I won't spend a bunch of time belaboring this point. But I think it's important to remember that and to know now that there's increasingly really good research trying to help us demonstrate the effects of sex research on people's lives. So this was a fairly recent survey done of Dutch adolescents and young adults. And participants reported very little distress, very little need for help, and most people reported positive feelings. And these distress and positive feelings weren't mutually exclusive, so people could report both things, which I think is an important thing to think about. In their study, they found that those who've experienced sexual violence reported more distress, but also more positive feelings than those without a history of sexual violence. So while they did report feeling down or sad, they also reported that participating in the research actually engendered some positive feelings for them. Those from a non-Western background experienced more distress than youth from Western backgrounds. The article we read this week talked about how Hispanic people in this sample reported more positive experiences. So I think this probably depends to a great degree on what kind of other population we're looking at. Often we're comparing white Westerners to some other group. And so I think who that other group is and their cultural and social history around sexuality probably makes a huge difference in how they react to this kind of research and these kinds of questioning. In their research, they found that women experience more distress than men. But there were no differences in distress or in positive feelings according to whether or not they engaged in sexual risk behavior or their level of sexual risk behavior. And I think it's really important to think about the potential harm of both asking and not asking about sexual experiences like childhood sexual abuse or sexual assault or intimate partner violence, for example. So not asking may actually lead to the development of inappropriate treatments that have the potential for trauma if we don't conduct research on people who have had traumatic experiences. Or if we aren't able to analyze how our treatment programs or interventions or whatever may have a differential impact on people with these kinds of experiences. So I think a lot of times researchers take the route of, I'm just not going to ask that because I don't want to deal with the potential distress that would involve. I don't want to have to argue with my IRB about it. And so I'm just not going to ask it. And I think it's really important to think both about the potential effects of asking and the potential effects of not asking about some of these negative or traumatic sexual experiences or interpersonal experiences. And there's other research indicating that questions about trauma or abuse are actually less likely than other kinds of daily experiences, like media, sexual experiences, things like that, to trigger recall. And I think another important piece to remember here is this autonomy piece, that participants are capable of declining research when they believe that it may be upsetting. So as I mentioned before, I have had to include that I'll ask specifically about childhood sexual abuse in my consent form And my understanding of the IRB's rationale in that is that if participants felt like they wouldn't be able to handle answering questions about that, they could know that before they actually get into the situation of answering questions about that and could decline the research if they feel like it would be upsetting. So we need to be able to trust people's ability to make their own decisions around whether or not they feel like they can participate in this kind of research. And I think it's also important to remember that that when we're balancing these benefits, these potential benefits and harms, it's not always black and white. I think the tea room trade is often used as an example of really bad research ethics, which I think it's an easy case to make. Your book talks about this. Probably most of you know about this particular situation. It's happened in the 1970s. Humphreys, who was a sociologist, I believe, served as a watch queen for roughly 100 men. So basically in rest stops where men would go to have sex with other men, he would offer to watch out for them and give them a signal if somebody was coming. And in this process, he recorded license plate numbers, and then obtained home addresses for people and names from police registers by posing as a market researcher. He later then showed up at their homes a year later with a different haircut and a different sort of style to try and disguise himself. But he later showed up at their homes to interview them for a health survey. He published results indicating that what had previously been known as deviants, men who had sex with men, were generally middle class, married, politically conservative men. And there are a lot of people who feel like that study really did a lot to change the way Americans thought about men who had sex with men. So certainly potential benefits to this research were the destigmatization of homosexuality in society. Others have indicated that there were reduced police raids in some districts. So some very real benefits to this population potentially. But there are a whole lot of potential harms in this situation too. So he used deception. There was a complete lack of informed consent. These men didn't know that they were part of a research study in any stage of this. Potential for breach of confidentiality, which has very serious consequences, and particularly at that time had very serious consequences. Potential for distress if men recognized him when he was interviewing them later, and an invasion of privacy. So there was a lot of potential harm, and some of the main things that we talk about in this one are a lack of informed consent, and potential for breach of confidentiality. Humphreys always maintained that he was incredibly sort of over-the-top careful about how he stored his research records. He supposedly had a storage facility somewhere that was 100 miles away from his research site that he never disclosed the location of to anybody. So he was over-the-top careful about keeping all of these records confidential. But the possibility of harm if there was a breach of confidentiality is pretty significant in this situation. So this is a situation in which we have to think about the balance of these potential benefits and harms. And there are a lot of strategies that we can put in place for minimizing the risk of harm and maximizing potential benefits. I think one of the ways that we can try and think a little bit more about this are to try and include questions about participation effects. So how did this research make you feel? How was answering these questions for you? To get a sense of the potential for harm or benefit in these situations. I think one of the things, and I think we often do this for the sake of IRBs, but I think we have to be careful about presenting the research in the informed consent process in a way that doesn't assume or precipitate a high potential for harm or distress. So for example, one of the things that we often say, and I think this is actually a direct copy and paste from an informed consent form that I've used, some of the questions are sensitive and it's possible that you may feel some distress as a result of participation. If you should become distressed as a result of your participation, contact so-and-so for referrals. Versus potentially saying something like, there are no known risks associated with participating in this research. However, if you become upset and would like to talk to someone, contact blah, blah, blah. So we have to think about, if we present the research as potentially harmful and scary and really bad, Does that actually do more harm potentially, or make people more distressed than presenting the research as something that is kind of a normal part of daily life? And these are questions that we encounter all the time if you go to the doctor or a therapist or what have you. Another thing that we can think about doing is utilizing community advisory boards or engaging in community-based participatory research to make sure that our research is culturally competent, is relevant for people, utilizes language that they understand and is appropriate for their situations, that we respond appropriately to disclosures. So whether that's being non-judgmental, whether that's thinking about trying to facilitate help or referrals, and thinking about how we respond to disclosures or sexual disclosures in particular. And I think one of the great things about being at Widener and in this program is that you're probably all very good at this. So one of the things that I've often done in training people is, you're going to hear all sorts of responses about sexual behavior that people engage in and how they feel about sexuality. And you have to try and maintain a non-judgmental response. And for people who don't have training in sexuality, that can be a tough thing to train them on. So I think you guys are probably particularly good at this and thinking about cultural competence and being non-judgmental. As I said, we'll talk more in just a second about balancing confidentiality with safety and reporting issues. So this training piece, I think, is key here. We also can provide referrals. Often for most of the studies that I do, I try and do a one-page sort of 1-800 number kind of referral list. So a hotline for suicide, a hotline for intimate partner violence, a hotline for drug and alcohol issues. I can't certainly, especially when I'm doing nationwide studies, it's very challenging to provide a thorough referral list for all places around the country. But if you give people some hotline numbers, that can be a really great way to connect them to care without you having to do all the digging to connect them to care. Publishing your data and making sure you're publishing and representing that data accurately and completely. I think your book talks a little bit about some of the ethical issues that are still involved in the process of publishing and disseminating your findings. But I think disseminating those findings and thinking through some of those ethical issues, even at that point, is something that we don't do enough of, perhaps. And again, as I mentioned before, when applicable, translating that research into practice. So as I mentioned a couple of times, I think one of the struggles that people often have, and something that I went through in the research center I was working with, was thinking about how to balance professional and research ethics. For most of us, we are psychologists, social workers, counselors, etc., and we have our own set of morals and ethics that guide our practice with people. And so there are some situations in which we have to think about if there are reporting requirements. So childhood sexual abuse, interpersonal violence, things like that. Are there different kinds of reporting requirements? One of the ones that I encountered most often was issues of suicidality. So we would always use most of the depression inventories, the scales that assess depression. One of the questions on most of those scales is, in the last week, how much have you thought about ending your life? And one of the things that we would do in research is if anybody said anything other than not at all. So I think the answers are like not at all, a little bit, a lot, all the time, or something like that. If they said anything other than not at all, we would sort of stop everything and check in on them, make sure they had a safety plan, make sure that they weren't actually going to do it. And we spent a lot of time in our research center debating, how much we wanted to step in, and how much of an ethical obligation that was as a researcher, as a psychologist, and how to convey to the participants what the limits of confidentiality were. So in our consent forms, we tell them everything you tell us is completely confidential unless you admit to us that you are perpetrating childhood sexual abuse or elderly abuse, or that you have serious thoughts of ending your life. That's not the exact wording we use, but that's the gist of it. And so we would give them a sense that there were some limits to confidentiality before we even went into the appointment. in these kinds of situations, if you have certain sort of guidelines that dictate your own practice, you want to be clear about your responsibilities and the appropriate regulations. Are you a mandated reporter? What must you report? We will also want to provide information to participants as to how to report abuse and get help. But again, we have to respect the autonomy of participants to make decisions about their own lives. And think about if our reporting may actually increase the potential for harm. And so in certain cases of abuse, interpersonal violence, this is especially the case. But at the end of the day, we have to respect the autonomy of participants to make decisions about their own lives. So what we ultimately ended up doing around suicidality is if we felt that somebody was an immediate harm to themselves, that they would potentially walk out of there and kill themselves or attempt to kill themselves, we would call the police. But when we would do that, we wouldn't necessarily call the police and say, hi, we have this person who's here participating in HIV research because they're HIV positive and they use drugs, and now they're about to kill themselves. We would just say, hi, here's this person. This is their name. They're in danger. And so sometimes we'd be able to keep them in the research center and actually have the police come and respond there. We've had situations in which we had people sort of storm out. One situation in which we had somebody say, I'm going to go and jump into the river right now and kill myself, and they stormed out. And that was a situation in which we called the police and let them know that this is where this person is headed. We don't know if they're actually going to do it, but that person is in immediate danger right now. And these were issues that we grappled with. So a team of clinical psychologists, social psychologists, really grappled with these issues. So I think it's important to remember that these are not always black and white issues to be able to think through. So I'll say a little bit about working with institutional review boards, and then otherwise I think your book and the NIH training cover this, the rest of this fairly well. IRBs may consider sexuality research to be more sensitive than other kinds of research. Again, I think we can approach this experience as an opportunity to educate your IRB, and increasingly there's great research out there that we can use to support our case that this is probably not as sensitive or potentially harmful as they might think it is. We often want to remind the IRB that negative feelings do not equal harm. We can provide literature demonstrating minimal harm is associated with asking participants about sex and sexuality, and really, again, refer to the guidelines laid out in ethics guidance. As I mentioned before, avoid framing the research as potentially harmful, and really try and be balanced in our identification of potential harms and benefits. I'm really working to ensure the IRB that we're implementing the best practices with regards to questions and procedures and being able to provide referrals, and that we've really thought through these issues and consulted with literature to be able to ensure best practices. So the NIH training does a really good job of these IRB review categories. I'll say a little bit more about them. The Widener website also does a great overview of the distinctions between exempt research, which is often considered research that has no harm. This is some examples of this are research using existing or publicly available data, research conducted on educational practices in established educational settings, survey data, cognitive test interviews, publicly available data that's anonymous. And so this is often thought of as no risk research that can go through an exempt review, which is typically just one person, often the chair of the IRB, who reviews your study and signs off on it. So exempt doesn't mean that it's not reviewed. It's just a certain category under the federal regulations. Expedited review is research that involves no more than minimal risk and falls into one of 10 categories that are outlined both in the NIH training and to some degree on the Widener IRB website. Minimal risk refers to situations in which the probability and magnitude of harm or discomfort anticipated in the research are not greater in and of themselves than those ordinarily encountered in daily life. So this is what the article that we read was referring to when trying to compare their reaction to research to waiting in line at the bank for 20 minutes or something, something that we wouldn't ordinarily do in daily life. And so that's why they made those particular comparisons, is because of this language about minimal risk. Full review, on the other hand, is research that involves anything more than minimal risk, intervention research, any research involving special or protected populations like prisoners, minors, pregnant women, those with cognitive impairments or disabilities. And there's the application review process tab in the IRB office on Campus Cruiser has a nice explanation of these categories and processes of review. It's also in the NIH training. The reason I have this asterisk up here is because I think it's important to remember that while these are the federal regulations guiding what kind of review your research should go under, a lot of IRBs just skip to either expedited or full review. And in some situations, you may mark that something should be exempt or expedited, and your institutional review board may say, nah, we're still going to review the full thing. We're going to put it under a full review. It has to go to the full committee. So there are sort of minimal guidelines set out by the federal government, but a lot of university IRBs and IRBs in general follow more of a cover your ass mentality when thinking about research. They are very much often focused on liability issues, and so it behooves them in some ways to do a full review of all of the research that's happening at their university. So even though you may think that something should be exempt or should be expedited, there's a good chance that it will go through full review. So that's always important to think about when you're planning the timeline of your project. Don't necessarily bank on it going through a fairly quick review, because that may not always be the case, even if it meets the guidelines for an exempt or an expedited review. We talked a little bit about informed consent. Creswell does like a quick checklist of these elements of consent. And if you look at the consent form template that's on the Widener website, these basic pieces of information are on that consent form. So identification of you and the institution, the purpose of the study, what they'll actually have to do to participate in the study, obviously the risks and benefits, issues around confidentiality, privacy, or anonymity, this assurance of the ability to discontinue participation with no penalty or consequence, and all of the contact information. And we'll spend more time talking about consent forms and the IRB application in our in-person time together. So a quick summary: as researchers and practitioners, we may be faced with ethical dilemmas in which the solution is not black and white. And I think we should be constantly sort of examining our practices to ensure that we meet or go beyond some of these basic ethical requirements. I think it really behooves us, particularly as sex researchers, to be active members of our IRBs and to actively work to educate our IRBs. Luckily, because you're all at Widener and they are fairly sensitized to sexuality research, I think the process is fairly decent here versus if you're a sex researcher in a university where you're the only one and potentially the first one putting forth this kind of research, you may have to do more work in that situation. But because you're at Widener and will be putting your dissertation research through the Widener IRB, I think they've already been broken in for us to some degree. But for more information, you should check out the APA Code of Ethics. Number 8 is the research code. The IRB office in Campus Cruiser under my offices. And I think your book talks about some more general principles around ethics. And one of the things that I love that your book includes in this particular section is political issues. I'll post a couple of articles that I think are interesting to think about sort of the political elements of sexuality research. In some ways, we are under additional scrutiny of our research because of its sexual nature. And I think there is a lot of potential attack, political attack and political scrutiny of our research. And that's a whole nother sort of layer of ethical and moral issues for us to navigate. And so I'll post a couple of articles about some interesting work that I've done with some people and some of the fallout on that work. But I definitely just wanted to mention that I think those political issues are an important piece of all of this. And I like that your book mentions that, though it's not directly related to sexuality per se. So that's it for this lecture. If you have questions or thoughts, please post those under the general discussion forum under our sort of course question section, and I'll do my best to address them. All right, thanks guys.